Okay, so we are going to take a little digression, and I think of this as an analytical digression as we go through the second chapter of Bikkurim. We've covered already the question of who can bring Bikkurim and what has to be brought. In the next chapter, in chapter 3, we're going to cover the question of how they are brought. But in this chapter, in chapter 2, in the analytical diversion, we're going to examine the similarities and the differences, if you like, the parallels between different kinds of things. And we're going to begin with a three-way comparison between terumah, Bikkurim, and Maaser Sheni. The Mishnah refers throughout Maaser, but it's talking about Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni, which we bring to Jerusalem, terumah, which we give to the priests. And then as the chapter progresses, we're going to get into different kinds of comparisons. We're going to start comparing different kinds of animals, different kinds of things. We're going to, this chapter is if you like, a chapter of comparisons. But we start with three parallel Mishnayot. The first about terumah and Bikkurim, the second Maaser Sheni and Bikkurim, and the third terumah and Maaser Sheni. So in other words, of these three kinds of offerings, we're going to pick two at a time, and we're going to examine their similarities. Of course, there are three groups of two, so we need three Mishnayot. Let's start. Terumah v'Bikkurim. Let's start with terumah and Bikkurim. And there are classic similarities. Chayavim alehem mitah. One's liable to death. That means if we eat them as a non-priest. This is death at the hands of heaven. We don't take someone out and subject him to a trial under capital punishment. But this is mitah al yedei shemaim, so to speak. Chayavim alehem mitah v'chomesh. The fifth applies. Remember, we've learned about the fifth is actually a quarter. If we redeem them, we have to add on a quarter. So that what we've added on becomes a fifth. They belong to a priest. Ve'olin be'echad umea. We learned about this in when we learned the Masechet of Terumah. But if Terumah, or for that matter, Bikkurim, fall in a grain silo, but in a dilution of less than 101 to 1, then we can fix the problem just by taking one measure out and giving it to a Kohen. If the dilution is more than 101 to 1, then the whole silo takes the status of doubtful terumah or doubtful Bikkurim, and that's a big problem for the farmer. And then they require washing of hands before they're eaten and the setting of the sun. This is a Kohen who's become tameh. He needs to wait for the setting of the sun and immerse before he can go in and eat his terumah or his Bikkurim. That's the first group. Second group are Maaser Sheni and Bikkurim. So not terumah, in other words, Maaser Sheni and Bikkurim. And of course, what we know is they have to be brought to Jerusalem in the words of the Mishnah. In the words of the Mishnah, She'amaaser v'Bikkurim tu'unim hava'at makom, bringing to the place. But there's only one place, right? And that's Jerusalem. And they require recitation. We recite, there's a recitation over the Maaser Sheni just as much as there is over the Bikkurim. They're both at the beginning of the parsha of Ki Tavo in Devarim. And they're forbidden to an onen. Although here Rabbi Shimon permits, and we're going to see throughout this Mishnah that Rabbi Shimon has a view that Bikkurim are really closer to terumah than they are to Maaser Sheni. So all of these examples, Rabbi Shimon will agree on the Maaser Sheni, but he sees Bikkurim as closer to terumah. And I understand, reading the Bartanura, he actually has a verse for this. He has a pasuk, but I'm embarrassed to say I don't know what the pasuk is, because the Bartanura doesn't tell us what the pasuk is. He says that there is a pasuk that says Bikkurim are terumah, but I can't find it. It's not one of the source pasukim we learn. If I manage to find it, I'll tell you. But Rabbi Shimon definitely knows which one it is. And if he could tell us, he would. And then there are other similarities. The Chayavim B'Vio, we got to get the fourth, the third year and the sixth year, we have to get rid of them from our house. Once Pesach comes, although Rabbi Shimon exempts for Bikkurim because he thinks they're like terumah. And once we get to the place, once we get to Jerusalem, the slightest mixture of them, no matter what the dilution is. In other words, the rule of 101 to 1 doesn't apply. Once you're in Jerusalem, if chulin and maaser, or chulin and bikkurim are mixed up, the whole thing acquires the status of the offering and has to be given to the Kohen. And even what grows from them, if you took that food and then planted it and something sprouted from it in Jerusalem, what grew from it would have the status of Maser Shino Bikkurim, and you'd have to give it to a Kohen. They're forbidden to non-priests or to, and you certainly can't give them to cattle. So that's the second group. Maser Sheni and Bikkurim, and their similarities are all focused on place. And then the third group are Truma and Maser, but not Bikkurim. So Truma and Maaser have got their own similarities, which we've learned, by the way, in the Masechtot, in the relevant Masechtot, where we've learned Truma, we've learned Maser Sheni. What do we know? Well, HaTruma v'HaMaaser osrin atagoren. They make the threshing floor forbidden. What's the Mishnah talking about here? It's talking about the food on the threshing floor. That once the food gets to the threshing floor, and we've talked about it reaching, if you like, the final state of preparation. Once the food gets to the threshing floor, we can't eat it until we've taken out Truma and Maaser. And this is not the case for Bikkurim. You can eat food before you've presented the Bikkurim, but you cannot eat Truma and Maaser until you've taken out what has to be taken out. Then the Mishnah explains, Yesh lahim shiur, there's a set amount. Well, we learn for Truma, the set amount is not very, very set. It can be anywhere between 1.5% and 2.5%, but in some way there's a set amount. And for Maaser Sheni, there's certainly a set amount because it's a 10%. But for Bikkurim, well, you just have to bring some Bikkurim. There's really no set amount at all for Bikkurim. So Bikkurim are very different here. That's one of the delightful things about Bikkurim, actually. You just kind of, you choose a nice fruit and you bring it to Jerusalem in your, well, we'll find out in the next chapter, in your gold basket. What else about Truma and Maaser? Well, they apply to all produce. Nohagim b'chol haperot. Anything they'll eat needs to have Truma and Maaser taken from it, even vegetables. Whereas we've learned in the previous chapter of Bikkurim that Bikkurim are only from the 7 species, only from the 7 species that the land of Israel is famous for. And we've already learned about the connection between Bikkurim and the land. There's this organic connection between the Bikkurim and the land. You have to be rooted in the land. You have to own the land in order to bring Bikkurim. Whereas for Truma and Maaser, if you're a sharecropper or a leaser or a sikari kon, remember we learned what a sikari kon is. It's someone who's basically forcibly he's acquired land by force, by threatening someone with essentially murder if they fail to sell. So he has acquired the land, but he hasn't really acquired it lawfully. And these fellows don't have to bring Bikkurim because they're not connected to the land. But they do have to bring Truma and Maaser. And the Mishnah says, Uva Gazlan, even if you're a thief, you have to bring Truma and Maaser, even though you're exempt from Bikkurim because you don't have ownership, right? You don't have ownership, you can't bring Bikkurim. And then the Mishnah concludes, this applies to Truma and Maaser, but not to Bikkurim. So what are we doing? Well, I guess we're enunciating the principles here. And we said yesterday that the Mishnah is recollecting. The Mishnah is being codified more than 100 years after the temple is no longer standing. But the rabbis are looking back and they're collecting in their minds the parallels, the similarities, and the differences. And they're organizing and synthesizing. And essentially what we've got in this chapter of the tractate is the result of their synthesis. So that's all from me. Let me stop recording.